Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be talking about pre-releases. Again. So pre-releases is that magical time of the year where a new set is about to come out and we could play with some of the new cards and experiment with what some of the new cards are going to be doing and have, well, a slightly different experience than what Digimon usually offers. So what a pre-release basically is you're going to walk into your store, you're going to buy 6 packs of the newest set, and then you're going to make a 40 card deck with a Digi-Ed deck of 0 to 5 cards, and, well, you're just going to open up those packs and build with what you pull. So it's a very interesting format for Digimon, but unfortunately Digimon isn't necessarily designed for this type of play, and it kind of shows in its set design. But that's a completely different topic, and what pre-release is basically doing is that the round format is going to be Swiss format, so the more you win, the stronger your opponents will be, supposedly, and then your sideboard is going to be cards that you pulled, and you can swap in and out between those cards that you pulled with what you had in your deck. And then you get to keep all of the cards that you open because, well, you opened them, you bought them, and then the only special rule is that the sealed format players can ignore Digivolution or color requirements. So you could basically Digivolve on top of any color and ignore that, but the exception is if a card is referring to a specific color or needs a specific color, then you have to abide by what the card says. So in order to use options, you still need to have a Digimon of the same color on the field, and if a Digimon is referring to, let's just say, red, then you have to have a red card for it to interact with. So that's the big difference, but outside of that, it's just your normal game of Digimon. So the important thing to understand when going into a limited or sealed environment is just knowing and understanding the pool of cards and how they want to be played and all of their interactions. Granted, sometimes you can't necessarily rely super heavily on a lot of their more specific interactions just because what you pull is out of your control, and that's just the RNG or fun aspect, is that RNG just acts as a great equalizer. So looking and understanding at what all of these cards are doing is just a very important thing to do, so that way you could properly evaluate and pick the cards that best support what the set is not only trying to do, but the cards that you're pulling and playing with are allowing you to do. So in Magic, we have an acronym called BREAD. So B stands for bombs. These are basically your big high-end cards, the cards that you have lots of impact, and that will help close the game as quickly as they possibly can. Then you have R for removal. These are the cards that are going to be acting as removal to interact with your opponent's field, so that way you could try to mitigate what they're trying to doing. Then E stands for evasion. In Digimon, this basically means your defensive cards, so it's just cards to help stall out the opponent. Most of the time, this is going to be your blockers and various other defensive tools that just stop the opponent from wanting to aggress. Then you have A for aggro, so these are your lower curve or low to the ground cards that just want to hit as quickly as they possibly can, just to try to close out the game as quickly as you can that way. So these are the cards that also just want to gain you lots of value the turn that you play them. And then D stands for duds. These are the cards that you never want to pick or play just because they're not really doing much, or they're really hard to use just because, well, they're requiring more specific synergies that you might not be able to line up. Most of the time, when it comes to evaluating the overall card pool, you're going to want to look at everything that is rare and below, just because even though the SRs are usually very, very powerful cards, they're going to be the cards that you're not going to be seeing very often, just because, well, they're higher rarity. Same thing with the secret rares. You just want to prioritize looking at the lower end cards in terms of rarity, so that way you could try to best figure out what synergizes very nicely with each other on top of what cards you actually want to be using and can use based on what you pull. So each set has particular themes and sub-themes that it wants to be playing around with to make the experience a little bit unique and interesting and make the set relatively desirable. The theme for BT08 is going to be about 2-color Digimon. So there's a lot of 2-color support for the set, and we could actually think about utilizing these supports in new and interesting ways in the context of a sealed and limited environment. So before, options, as an example, were relatively hard to play just because we needed to meet the color requirement of the card being on the field to use that option, and with a 2-color Digimon, we could have more representation in colors to be able to utilize those options easier while those Digimon are on the field. And even though not all of the two-color Digimon are going to be that great because sometimes they do have an alternative evolution cost that is a little bit more specific, the fact that they still have an evolution cost in the terms of a sealed or limited environment doesn't necessarily matter because we have Rainbow Evolution to do wild and crazy things with. But we do have some really good cards that are just native two-color cards to act as more generic support that we have an easier time utilizing, so generally these might be some more high priority cards because of their reduced in evolution cost to make them easier to use. But we do also have some other cards in the set to help search out just generically two-color cards, and with a lot of different two-color cards in the set, it just makes these cards even more playable outside of their baked-in synergy because they're supposed to be targeting more specific cards for their designed deck, but because this is limited, it's just asking for two colors, which we could easily meet depending on the cards that we're seeing in our pool. But one thing to keep in mind is the fact that DNA Digivolution, or Jogress for short, is a mechanic that actually is requiring you to have specific colors. You still have to meet those color requirements because it is stated on the card itself. So similarly to how hybrids worked in BT7 is how you're going to have to treat DNA Digivolution in terms of actually meeting the specific color requirements to be able to utilize this alternative evolution. But the cool thing is that because we have lots of extra two-color Digimon, we have lots of different ways to be able to set up those two colors to be able to utilize DNA Digivolution in a sealed and limited environment. But in terms of the overall design of the set, I actually think this is going to be one of the more interesting and fun sealed and limited environments just because there's not a whole lot of true dud cards that are in the set. We do have some cards that are asking for some specific synergy, but those are far and few between in terms of ways that they're intended to be used, and we still have ways that we could use them alternatively to still make the card relatively playable. So in terms of actual true duds that are looking for more specific support, we don't really have a whole lot of that, which is really cool because that just increases the overall experience on what we could do with our cards and how we could play our cards. So usually the first thing you want to do when thinking about building your deck is evaluate what your card pool is and look to see where your bomb cards are. As I stated before, bombs are basically those big game finishers or really strong and powerful cards that you know are going to be persistent and cause the opponent lots of problems if it's going to stay around for more than a turn or two. So usually these are going to be on the level 5s and ups. If your game plan is just going low to the ground and aggro, then that is perfectly fine as well. But most of the time when I'm talking about the big bombs, I'm talking about cards that when you play them have a high level of impact. So I think when it comes to a lot of bombs, a lot of the DNA Digivolution cards are going to be absolutely fantastic to try to incorporate just because we have easy ways to be able to play the card. Like I stated before, you still will have to meet the color restrictions on the card to be able to DNA Digivolve it, but the fact that we do have alternative ways and the fact that they are a little bit stronger than your normal level 5 makes them easier to want to utilize them. But outside of that, usually you're going to want to look at some really good level 6s to try to be a really powerful card to end on, so that way you know it's going to be a huge problem for the opponent. So you could go as something as generic as Ultimate Brachiomon, as just a vanilla card that just has some really powerful stats, or you could go with something with a little bit more synergy, like a Zulongmon, to try to make more powerful plays possible based on the effects you're trying to be playing around with. Then, knowing the opponent is going to want to try to utilize their big bombs, you also need to have some contingency plans in order to stop and interact with their Digimon. So usually that's going to be in the form of lots of removal cards, and we do have different ways that we could remove cards in the set. Most commonly, you're going to want to use specific options to be able to try to figure out ways to delete the opponent's Digimon, whether it's just straight up deleting, or DP reducing, or attacking into and suspending. So those are all just a whole bunch of different effects that we could try to utilize, but we could also try utilizing them on some of our Digimon to also act as some of our removal, like Metal Greymon's when Digivolving ability to try to shrink the opponent's Digimon, which could be very disruptive and annoying for them, on top of potentially deleting a low-level Digimon as well. But if you don't feel like you have enough removal or the ability to remove well enough, then you're going to be wanting to look at your evasive cards to still try to have some interaction with the opponent's Digimon. Again, this is going to be in the form of the blocker ability more often than not, so that way you actually have a Digimon to physically stop the opponent's Digimon from doing something, and we do have a couple of really decent blockers that we could try to take advantage of. So Frozomon is just the only generic blocker with the blocker ability built in, so this is going to be a pretty high value card, and the fact that he is on a slightly higher level Digimon means that he could easily wall out some of the opponent's low level Digimon. But speaking of the blocker ability, we do have a card like Skull Knightmon Cavalier mode to be able to Digivolve into him and gain those keywords as well, and if we Digivolve past him in that same turn, then we could spread those keywords to whatever Digimon we're Digivolving into temporarily to try to halt some of the opponent's aggression. Then we also have cards like Greymon, where it's a card that's able to give the blocker ability a little bit more permanently as long as you have a red Digimon in play, which is pretty easy to meet considering we have the ability to just have lots of different colors represented on our field, and if you're Digivolving this into a red Digimon, then it's already going to meet the color requirements to be able to have that Digimon be a blocker as well, to be able to wall out and stop the opponent's aggression. Now, I would normally recommend a particular formula for you to try to follow when constructing your deck, but I feel like that's a little bit disingenuous just because you might not be able to follow that formula to the T, depending on what your pool of cards is looking like, and you might have to find alternative ways to be able to aggress onto the opponent. So sometimes you might just see a whole bunch of rookies, so that way you could kind of go into this rookie rush style of gameplay, and sometimes you might see very few rookies, and you have to think alternatively on how you could play your cards. So a card like Aquilamon might actually be more valuable just because he could act as a pseudo-rookie while being a level 4 to climb your stages alternatively. So we do have lots of different ways to be able to aggress onto the opponent depending on what your pool of cards is looking like, but most of the time you're going to want to have a decent number of low-end cards, so that way you could try to climb the stages relatively easy with, and if you're unable to climb the stages relatively easy with, then you could still aggress onto the opponent with those low-end cards and try to rush them down and outvalue them, because if they're playing one card per turn and they're giving you lots of memory, you could basically outmaneuver them with a 2-to-1, so you could potentially play 2 cards to their 1, so that way you could, again, try to be able to maneuver around what the opponent is potentially planning to be able to aggress onto them. But that's kind of the push and pull dynamic on different ways that you could build your deck, because you don't necessarily have control over the pool of cards that you're going to be seeing to be able to stick to a particular formula. So if you need to go low to the ground because that's what your pool of cards say, then you should try to support your deck and pool the best that you can that way. If your deck wants to go more traditional stack based and build up to a big Digimon for a big finish, then you want to try to build and support your deck that way. Or if you just want to hard slam big bodies to try to gain as much value out of those big bodies as you possibly can, then again, that's just another approach that your pool of cards might allow. But there still are cards in the set that you probably want to stay away from just because their synergies might be a little bit too specific in terms of the targets that it's looking for and what it's trying to be interacting with. So most of these are unfortunately going to be on black and purple, and there are specific cards in those colors that you want to avoid. So Agumon here is just looking for Dragonkins and Greymons, and you're not really going to be having available access to a lot of different Dragonkins and Greymons, so it's not going to be that worthwhile to try to utilize that ability. Thankfully, you could just Digivolve the card as a level 3 Digimon, so it's still somewhat usable, but in terms of trying to actually utilize its effect, it's pretty much useless. Then we do have other cards like X Antibodies that are interacting in that same style of manner, where you could just use the card as basically a vanilla, because you're not realistically going to be able to gain any of the abilities off of these cards. So we do have them on the level 3, 4, and 5 slot, that are going to be harder to try to utilize and line up their abilities because they're just so built into their own game plan and how they want to play. And then as the last big black dud card, we do have the Tamer that's trying to interact with X Antibodies, so if you don't have a whole lot of X Antibodies to be playing around with, then this Tamer probably isn't even worth running. Tamers already are in this really awkward space where they're somewhat hard to run in a limited environment, so I definitely wouldn't prioritize utilizing the Tamer that has more specific interactions that you can't get off generically. And the Purple Tamer is in that same camp, where it does have some very specific synergies that it wants to be interacting with to make itself usable, so it's best to avoid a card like this, so that way you don't even have to worry about trying to line up those synergies, which your pool might not even support. And speaking of synergies that your pool might not support, we also have Myotismon that, again, is trying to interact with that card specifically, and if you don't see that card, then Myotismon just becomes that much worse of a card to use. You could, again, try to use him as a vanilla card, but sometimes cards just have an effect that, even at worst, can still negatively impact you. So if you're not digivolving this into the racing area, and hard playing it for 8 is a little bit on the expensive side compared to some of the other cards you could just hard play for 8, he's just a worse card than a lot of what other cards that you could be running, because he'll just negatively impact your deck. On top of the fact that we do have Rasengan Fury Mode as another card that could very negatively impact your deck, just because he'll have a passive ability that you can't get rid of because you don't have a level 7 to be able to digivolve on top of. And his based in synergy is interacting with cards from outside of the set, so you can't even reasonably use him to his utmost potential with the cards that we do have. But as far as my overall thoughts on how I think the BT08 sealed format is going to play like, I think it's going to be a really interesting experience, just because we do have lots of different cards that support the ability to utilize multiple different colors, and because everything is more color based, it opens up lots of more paths for different synergies for us to utilize. Then on top of that, because of that, like I stated before, options become more useful. We have lots of tamers that can be used in interesting ways with various other Digimon, so it's going to be a more open format, and I think because of that, it's actually going to be a less low to the ground aggro format, and more of a build a stack type of a format to try to build really powerful Digimon and interact with the fact that we do have lots of 2-color support that we could be playing around with, and these alternative ways to digivolve our cards could make or break certain lines of play to make our decks even more powerful than they've ever been before in terms of how Sealed and Limited is played. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.